In June of 1889, the people of Red Flint Basin looked up at the rock slope above town and saw a man working like winter was already at the door. Harlan Vale, a widowed settler who had not lived like other men for years, stood beside his cabin in the full heat of summer and laid sliced mountain plums across slanted drying frames. He hung long ribbons of pumpkin beneath sheets of muslin. He stretched rabbit meat on rawhide racks. He carried sack after sack of salt up the hill with the steady patience of a mule and the silence of a man who no longer wasted words. Down at Jonas Reed's store, the basin's general merchant leaned on the porch rail and watched the hill with the rest of them. Orson Pike, a loud ranch hand with more opinions than foresight, laughed first. "That man's gone wrong in the head," he said. "Drying food in June, like snow's coming tomorrow." A few others joined him, then more. By noon, half the basin was smiling at the same sight. From below, Harlan's place looked less like a home and more like some strange workshop built for starving times that did not yet exist. Frames, cloth, salt, meat, smoke, nothing about it looked normal. Nothing about it looked cheerful. Harlan never looked down at the laughter. He kept turning the fruit, kept checking the cloth, kept working. They thought he was preparing too early for winter. They did not understand that he was preparing for a sentence winter had already passed once before. If this hard country means something to those listening, mark the trail with a like, subscribe, and say where this story finds them tonight. What the basin could not see from the store porch was that Harlan Vale was not drying food in scattered patches of habit or fear. He was building a system. South of the cabin stood 3 slanted drying frames, each angled to catch the longest run of afternoon sun. Muslin covered them in pale sheets, so flies could not touch the fruit or the squash. Beside the frames sat shallow trays made from split pine, where sliced plums darkened slowly and pumpkin strips lost their shine hour by hour. Along the east wall ran a low smoke trench, cut into the earth and capped with flat stone. It carried cold smoke from a small fire pit into a tight cedar chamber where venison hung from pegs in neat rows. The meat did not cook there. It tightened, darkened, hardened. Time and smoke did the rest. Near the cabin footing, Harlan had dug a pit cellar below the frost line and lined it with sandstone and dry ash. Inside lay yellow turnips, winter squash, wild onion bulbs, and burdock root, each set apart so dampness could not spread from one to the next. Above, in the loft, bunches of sage, mint, yarrow, and thyme hung thick as curtains, drying in the slow draft beneath the roof boards. He worked before first light. He worked after sunset, turned the ridge black. He turned fruit, trimmed rot, checked cloth, shifted hooks, scraped ash, tested airflow with the back of his hand. Down in Red Flint Basin, the talk kept going. Mabel Pike, the sharp-tongued wife of ranch hand Orson Pike, called the place a graveyard kitchen. Jonas Reed quietly noted that Harlan had not bought coffee, sugar, or whiskey in months. He bought salt, twine, muslin, pegs, barrels, things that did not comfort a man, things that kept him alive. And that was the first small proof. This was not a passing oddity, not a lonely man's strange summer habit. It was labor with structure. Labor with memory. Labor aimed straight at a future no one else believed was coming. But Harlan Vale had not always worked like a man racing winter. 4 years earlier, in the winter of 1885, the cabin on that same slope held a different kind of life. The fire burned longer then. The door opened more often. Laughter carried across the ridge when the wind was right. Harlan still worked hard in those days. Every settler did. But the work ended with supper and a chair near the stove. His wife, Elena Vale, kept the small cabin warm in ways that had nothing to do with firewood. She moved through the narrow rooms with quiet certainty, tending the kettle, mending shirts, keeping the shelves ordered with jars and sacks that made a house feel steady. Their daughter, Ruth, 8 years old and always half a step too fast for her boots, spent her days racing the cold outside and dragging clumps of snow across the floor when she burst through the door again. Her winter boots were always a size too big. Elena insisted children grew faster than leather. The cabin was small, one room for living, a loft above, a stove that rattled when the wind pushed hard against the valley. But it was enough. Winter came every year to Red Flint Basin. The settlers expected it the way farmers expect rain. Hard, sometimes cruel, but familiar. That winter arrived differently. The first storm rose out of the north without warning. Snow came sideways. The wagon trace through Narrowgate Pass closed 2 days earlier than anyone predicted. The wind shifted direction twice in a single night, something the old trappers said was never a good sign. At first, Harlan believed the way most men believed. Storms came, storms passed, a few difficult days, then the sky would clear and the basin would breathe again. He split more wood. He checked the door latch. He stacked extra blankets near the bed. But the cold that winter did not knock politely at the door. It leaned against the walls. It pressed through the boards. And before Harlan Vale understood what kind of winter had truly arrived, the season had already begun making its claim. The storm did not pass. 3 days became 5. 5 became 10. The wind never truly stopped. It only changed direction, scraping snow against the cabin walls like a blade dragged slowly across wood. The wagon trace remained buried. No freight wagons came through Narrowgate Pass. No travelers appeared. The basin disappeared behind a curtain of white. Inside the cabin, the fire burned day and night. At first, Harlan fed it with split logs stacked behind the shed. Then with fence rails. Then with the spare chair Elena had once insisted they keep for visitors who never came. When the woodpile thinned to nothing, he began breaking apart anything that would burn. A broken crate, an old shelf, even the small table Ruth used when she practiced writing her letters. The cold did not leave when the flames rose. It waited behind the walls. Elena's cough started quietly. At first, she waved it away. "Cold air," she said. "Too much smoke." But the cough deepened as the days dragged on, and her strength faded with it. Ruth grew quieter too. One evening, she stood near the stove and asked for more food, in a voice so small Harlan would remember it, long after every other sound of that winter had faded. There was very little left to give. Harlan wrapped his coat tight and stepped outside into the white storm, searching the ridge for anything that might burn. Dead branches, fence posts buried in drifts, even twisted brush frozen beneath ice. When he came back inside, his hands had gone stiff and pale. He could barely feel the axe handle when he split the wood. The fire burned brighter that night, but it was already too late. Elena died first, her breathing growing shallow beneath the blankets while the wind rattled the walls. Ruth followed not long after. When Harlan lifted her from the bed, she still held a torn strip from her mother's quilt in one small hand. For many days the ground was too hard to break. When the thaw finally loosened the soil, Harlan carried both bodies east of the cabin, to a narrow ledge of earth beneath the rock face. He dug the graves himself. No tears came, no prayers. He closed his mouth so tightly his teeth cut the inside of his lip, and in that silent moment, Harlan Vale learned the one law winter never bothers to explain. Winter does not care if a man is good. It asks only one question: were you ready? Years later, in the summer of 1889, the cabin on the slope had become a place where work never stopped. One morning, while the sun was still low over Red Flint Basin, Harlan Vale stood beside a long table outside the cabin washing his drying trays. The water in the bucket was mixed with hot ash from the stove, a rough lye solution that stripped grease and insects from the wood. That was when Dr. Elias Mercer, the basin's traveling physician and one of the few educated men in the valley, rode up the narrow path. Most people who came that far up the hill arrived with laughter or suspicion. Mercer arrived with a question. He watched the smoke trench first, then the hanging venison, then the drying frames. "Why cold smoke?" he asked. Harlan did not stop scrubbing the tray. "Hot smoke cooks meat," he said. "Cold smoke keeps it alive longer." Mercer nodded slowly. He told Harlan about a rail town far north where he had worked years earlier. A winter storm had buried the tracks for weeks. The town had food in its stores, but almost nothing preserved. Fresh meat rotted, grain spoiled. By the time the rail line reopened, the cemetery had grown by a dozen graves. No one thought about drying food until after the snow came, Mercer said quietly. For a moment, both men looked at the racks, the smoke trench, the barrels of salt. The conversation ended there, but for the first time in years, Harlan Vale had spoken with a man who did not laugh, a man who understood that preparation was not madness. It was memory turned into method. By the end of July, the land itself began to speak. Most people in Red Flint Basin never noticed, but Harlan Vale did. One afternoon, he paused beside the drying racks and looked up when a flock of sandhill cranes crossed the valley. Their formation angled farther west than usual, drifting away from the basin weeks earlier than they normally traveled. Birds rarely make mistakes like that. 2 mornings later, he saw jackrabbits along the ridge, their coats already thickening, though the true heat of summer had not yet faded. The fur stood heavy along their backs, as if the animals were preparing for cold that had not arrived. Then the sky changed. Toward evening, low, lead-colored clouds began clinging to the spine of the mountains. They did not rise or scatter the way summer clouds should. They settled there like weight pressing down on the range. At the creek below the hill, Harlan noticed something else. The trout had already abandoned the shallow pools. They moved deeper under the stones where the water stayed colder and steadier. Even the wind shifted. A dry northern current slipped into the basin on nights that should have still held warm air from the plains. None of these signs shouted. Nature rarely does. But to a man who had once buried his family, after ignoring the first quiet warnings of winter, the message was clear. Harlan did not ride into town to explain what he saw. He simply worked faster. 2 more drying frames went up beside the first 3. The pit cellar gained another layer of stone. 2 full barrels of trout were salted before dusk. The smoke chamber was sealed tighter against damp air. That was how Harlan Vale answered when the land itself began to speak. Late that same week, another visitor climbed the narrow path to the cabin. Silas Vane, the basin's appointed magistrate and the man who kept records of land claims and debts, rode up the slope on a tall bay horse. He dismounted slowly and studied the yard without greeting. His eyes moved across the drying frames, the smoke trench, the hanging venison, the stacked barrels of salt. He looked at the place the way a merchant inspects machinery. Word in town says you bought nearly every barrel of salt Jonas Reed had in storage, Vane said at last. Harlan Vale stood beside the racks, turning a strip of pumpkin so the sun reached both sides. Winter comes every year, he said. Vane smiled faintly. Yes, but most people prepare for it when the season arrives. Red Flint Basin is doing well. The wagon trace through Narrow Gate Pass is open. Trade is steady. No one needs to live like the world is ending. He walked a few slow steps through the yard, studying the slope above the valley. You chose an interesting place for a cabin, he continued. High ground, clear view of the basin, good drainage. If a community storage house were ever needed, this ridge would serve very well. Harlan did not look up. Maybe one day, Vane added lightly, when the work becomes too much for one man to manage alone. Only then, did Harlan answer. By the time people decide they need a storehouse, he said, they won't have time to build one. For a moment, neither man spoke. The wind moved through the drying cloth. The horse stamped once on the dirt. No threats were raised, no voices lifted. But the distance between the 2 men had already been measured. One believed in paper, titles, and the comfort of present prosperity. The other believed in winter. September arrived without the calm harvest weather the basin expected. The rain began as a steady fall that farmers welcomed. Fields needed it. Wells welcomed it. But the rain did not stop. Day after day it kept coming. Not gentle rain, hard rain, cold rain. The kind that strikes earth like hammer blows and slowly grinds soil into mud. The wagon traced through Narrow Gate Pass, the only freight road feeding Red Flint Basin, turned slick as grease. Wagon teams struggled along the narrow switchbacks. One supply train tried the crossing and turned around before the summit. The next wagon never appeared at all. Then the thunder came. Late one night, lightning cracked across the mountains, followed by a deep sound that rolled through the valley like distant artillery. On the western face of the pass, water had soaked deep into the rock seams for days. When the mountain finally shifted, it did not fall in pieces. It collapsed. A wall of mud, broken trees, and shattered stone tore down the slope and buried the wagon trace beneath tons of debris. The road that had carried flour, salt, tools, and medicine into the basin simply vanished. By morning, the rain had eased. Men rode out to inspect the damage. They returned before noon with faces that told the story before words did. The pass was gone. The basin was sealed. Red Flint Basin woke that morning and discovered it had become an island, surrounded not by water, but by mountains and winter waiting beyond them. Up on the ridge, Harlan Vale stood on the small porch outside his cabin and looked down at the scattered rooftops below. He did not feel fear for himself. His racks were full. The cellar was deep. The smoke trench still breathed thin gray lines into the cold morning air. What troubled him were the houses in the valley, the ones where children still slept under thin blankets, the ones where parents believed the town would somehow manage. For the first time since the rains began, Harlan understood something with perfect clarity. The winter test had begun. In the first weeks, after the pass collapsed, Red Flint Basin tried to behave as though nothing had truly changed. People spoke calmly in public. Wagons still moved along the main street. Men still gathered outside Jonas Reed's general store, though the conversations had grown shorter. Silas Vane assured everyone the situation could be managed. "We ration carefully," he said during one meeting outside the store. "The road will be cleared before winter truly settles in." For a time, people believed him, but supplies disappear in quiet ways. First, the flour sacks ran thin. Then the barrels of lamp oil emptied. Coffee vanished. Dry beans followed soon after. Even the cheap cornmeal that usually sat untouched at the back of the store began to disappear. Jonas did not announce shortages. He simply removed empty crates and left bare shelves behind. Soon trading began. A rifle exchanged for a sack of onions. A copper kettle traded for 2 handfuls of cornmeal. A saddle offered for 3 jars of lard. In the basin's small saloon, voices dropped lower each week. One evening, Orson Pike, the same ranch hand who had laughed loudest at the sight of drying fruit on the ridge, stared into his cup and spoke words no one in the room wanted to say first. "Maybe that man up the hill knew something," he muttered. No one answered. Outside town, on the slope above the valley, a thin line of smoke rose steadily from Harlan Vale's cabin. The drying frames still stood. The cellar was still closed. A lantern still burned in the window after sunset. From the basin floor, people noticed something they had not noticed before. Their eyes kept drifting upward toward the hill, but no one rode up. Not yet. By the end of October, the nights in Red Flint Basin had grown sharp enough to split breath into white clouds. That was when the first knock came. It was late, the kind of hour when wind rattled the boards and the ridge went silent, except for the low hiss of smoke leaving the trench beside the cabin. Harlan Vale heard the knock once, then again, weak, uneven. He opened the door with a rifle already in his hand. A boy stood in the darkness. Noah Breyer, 15 years old, the son of a struggling trapper who had fallen on hard seasons, looked smaller than his age. A ragged horse blanket hung around his shoulders. His boots were wet through. His face carried the hollow look of someone whose body had already begun feeding on itself. "I'm not asking to stay," the boy said quietly. "Just something to eat before I pass out." Then he collapsed across the threshold. When Noah woke, the cabin ceiling was above him, and warmth moved through the air in slow currents. The loft beams were crowded with bundles of wild onion and herbs drying in neat rows. The racks along the wall held strips of darkened meat. Barrels stood sealed beside the cellar hatch. A faint thread of smoke drifted through the small curing chamber near the back wall. A pot simmered on the stove. "Juniper broth." Harlan handed the boy a bowl, but watched carefully. "Slow," he said. Noah obeyed. After the bowl was empty, Harlan sat across the table and spoke the rules without raising his voice. "You work every day." Noah nodded. "You don't tell people what you see here." Another nod. "You don't steal." The boy shook his head. "And you don't do foolish hero work that gets people killed." Noah understood that one. Without explanation, he agreed to all four. Outside, the wind moved along the ridge. Inside the cabin, something had quietly changed. For the first time since the graves were dug on the eastern ledge, the place was no longer built for one man alone. November arrived early that year. The first snow did not drift gently over Red Flint Basin. It slammed down in thick, wet sheets that clung to roofs and froze hard before morning. Chimneys smoked day and night. Doors stayed shut. People burned wood faster than they had planned. Then the first child died. The boy had slept beneath too few blankets in a cabin where the firewood had run out. By dawn, his body was stiff with cold. 2 nights later, another house caught fire. Someone had heated stones too close to the stove and stacked them against the wall to trap warmth. The boards ignited while the family slept. Panic spread faster than the snow. By the second week of the storm, riders began climbing the slope above the basin. At the front of the small group came Orson Pike, the ranch hand whose laughter had once carried across the valley when Harlan first hung fruit to dry. Now his face held no humor at all. Behind him rode 3 other families, each with children bundled in blankets against the wind. They stopped at the edge of the yard. No one spoke for a moment. Finally, Orson stepped forward. "Kids first," he said. "That's all we're asking." Harlan Vale looked at the small faces peering from behind coats and scarves. Thin, pale, eyes too tired for their age, he answered without hesitation. "The children stay," he said. Relief moved through the group like wind through grass. Then Harlan continued, "The adults go back down." The relief stopped. "1 load of firewood or peat every day for every child here," he said. "No fuel, no extra food." A few parents protested. Most did not. They understood the arithmetic. Food without heat meant nothing. One by one, the children were lifted down from saddles and guided toward the cabin door. Some cried when their parents turned their horses downhill again. Others simply watched in silence. Inside the cabin, the space filled quickly with wet boots, coughing, and the sound of small hands working. Harlan divided the work by age. Carry wood, wash trays, turn drying fruit, clean tools. Noah Breyer moved among them, showing the younger ones what to do. By nightfall, the cabin had become something entirely new. Not a refuge of comfort, a settlement built on rules. A place where survival belonged only to those willing to earn it. Not long after the children began filling the cabin, another rider came up the frozen slope. Walter Quill, a quiet homesteader from the far edge of the basin, carried his daughter wrapped in a worn gray blanket. The man's beard was crusted with frost. His horse moved slowly, ribs showing through its winter coat. Walter did not argue about the rules. He did not ask for shelter. He only held the girl closer and spoke one sentence. "Take her," he said. "That's all I'm asking." The child's name was May Bell. She was small for her age, pale from weeks of thin meals, and quieter than most of the children who had already filled the cabin. When Walter turned his horse back toward the basin, May did not cry. She simply watched him disappear into the falling snow. Inside the cabin, she worked. She swept the floor without being told. She carried water from the barrel. She stacked kindling beside the stove. Small hands, careful movements. She seemed to understand something the older children still struggled to learn. Every hand had to matter. At night, when the others had settled into their blankets and the fire burned low, May often sat near the stove where Harlan Vale kept watch over the dying coals. She rarely spoke. Many nights passed that way before Harlan finally asked the question, "What do you want, girl?" May looked at the fire for a moment before answering, "I just want to know you'll still be here when I wake up." The words were simple, but they landed in a place inside Harlan that had not stirred since the winter when Ruth Vale's boots stopped running across the cabin floor. As winter tightened around the basin, another problem began to show itself. Harlan Vale started noticing tracks in the snow. They appeared at the edge of the ridge first. Wide circles, careful steps. Whoever made them never came straight toward the cabin. The prints stayed just far enough away to study the ground, the windows, the slope of the hill. Those were not the tracks of someone asking for help. They were the tracks of someone measuring distance. Harlan said nothing to the children inside. Instead, he brought Noah Breyer outside one gray afternoon and showed him how to read snow the way hunters read sign. Wind makes soft edges, Harlan said quietly. Boots don't. He showed Noah how to move low against the wall, how to keep the lantern away from the window at night, how to listen for footsteps under the wind. Then he set the traps, 2 steel traps, hidden beneath a thin skin of snow near the back door where the shadows stayed deepest. The night the lesson proved necessary came without warning. The children were asleep. The wind scraped along the ridge. The fire had burned low. Then the traps snapped. A scream tore through the dark. Harlan was already awake. He stepped outside with the rifle in his hands and the lantern behind him. A man lay in the snow, clutching his leg where the steel teeth had closed. It was Bram Cutter, a rough drifter known around the basin for drinking hard and asking few questions about ownership. Harlan did not fire the rifle. He simply stood there while Cutter pried himself free, leaving blood in the snow and pride scattered beside it. The man dragged himself down the slope before dawn. By morning, the story had already spread through Red Flint Basin. The cabin on the ridge was not an easy place to rob. It was a place that fought back. January came with a cold the basin had not felt in years. An ice fog settled over the valley and did not lift for days. It turned every tree into a pale ghost and swallowed sound before it could travel far. Even the creek below the ridge moved slowly beneath a thin sheet of glassy ice. Food was still holding, but the fish nets set beneath the creek bank had to be checked. That morning, Noah Breyer took 2 of the older children down the slope to help him pull the lines. One of them was Eli Taro, a 9-year-old boy whose quick grin had become one of the few bright things left in the crowded cabin. Eli had a way of making Maybelle laugh, even on the coldest nights. The fog thickened as they reached the water. Shapes blurred. Distance disappeared. Noah crouched beside the creek, breaking ice away from the rope tied to the submerged net. Eli stood a few steps behind him, holding the coil of line the way he had been taught. Then the sound came. A rifle cracked through the fog. Short, sharp. Eli fell. For a moment, Noah did not understand what had happened. Then he saw the red spreading through the snow beneath the boy's coat. He dropped the rope and pulled Eli into his arms. "No, stay with me," Noah whispered, pressing the child close, trying to force warmth back into a body that was already losing it. Through the fog, he caught a brief glimpse of a rider moving between the trees. Jed Sutter, a hard-eyed drifter who had been seen around the basin before winter closed the pass. Then the rider vanished. By the time Noah carried Eli back up the ridge, the boy's breathing had already faded into silence. Harlan Vale met them at the cabin door. He did not ask what had happened. He saw it in the way Noah held the body. Another grave was dug on the eastern ledge beneath the rock face, beside the 2 older ones already resting there. When the mound was finished, Maybelle stepped forward quietly and placed a small cloth pouch on the snow above it. Inside were dried mountain plums from the summer racks, as if no one beneath that frozen ground should ever be hungry again. By late winter, the supplies inside the cabin were no longer abundant. The barrels were lighter, the cellar baskets thinner. Every cut of venison, every turnip, every string of dried onion had to be counted before the pot was filled. Harlan Vale began keeping careful marks beside the stove, not numbers of comfort, numbers of survival. One night's broth meant less food for the next. One extra ladle meant another day shortened somewhere ahead. It was during this tightening of rations that Silas Vane returned to the ridge. He rode up alone again, his coat heavy with frost, his eyes moving across the yard the same way they had the first time, measuring, weighing. "You've done impressive work here," Vane said calmly, looking at the racks, the smoke trench, the cellar hatch. "The basin could benefit from organization like this." He paused before continuing. "A council-managed storehouse would ensure fair distribution. Your cabin could serve as the center of it." Harlan did not answer immediately. Inside the cabin, children moved quietly between tasks. Noah stacked wood near the stove. Maybelle wiped frost from the inside of a window. "This place isn't a council building," Harlan said at last. Vane's expression barely changed. "You should think carefully," he replied. "People in town are beginning to ask questions. They're wondering how one man came to have so much food while the rest of the basin starved." The words were spoken softly, but the meaning behind them carried weight. Silas Vane did not just want the ridge. He wanted the story that had been built there. And Harlan understood something then. The final fight would not only be about food, it would be about who controlled the truth of how that food had come to exist. 5 nights after Silas Vane left the ridge, the attack came. It began with glass breaking. A bottle of kerosene crashed through the small smoking chamber beside the cabin wall. Flames followed instantly. Oil spread across the wooden boards, and the dry beams caught fire with a violent roar. The blaze was bright enough to turn the snow orange. It was a simple trap. If Harlan Vale rushed outside to save the racks, the barrels, the smokehouse, the food that meant life, he would step directly into the open. But Harlan did not move toward the fire. He moved toward the children. "Inside corner," he ordered, his voice sharp and fast. The children scrambled across the cabin floor. Noah Breyer grabbed 2 of the younger ones and pushed them toward the stone wall beside the stove, where the flames could not reach. "Back door," Harlan told him. Noah took position there with the rifle Harlan had shown him how to hold weeks earlier. Harlan stepped toward the front window. The night exploded. A shot cracked from the darkness outside. Harlan fired back once. Another shot. Then another. A shape moved in the snow. Someone fell. The attackers had expected panic. They had expected a man scrambling to save his supplies. Instead, they found a man guarding a fortress. Within seconds, the riders were retreating into the darkness beyond the ridge. By the time the fire was stamped out and the yard searched, only signs remained behind. Blood in the snow, boot prints leading down the slope, and a wool scarf torn loose during the retreat. It belonged to Amos Sutter, the older brother of the man who had fired the shot weeks earlier in the fog. 3 days later, the basin gathered inside the small wooden chapel to argue about the last rationing plans before spring. That was when the door opened. Amos Sutter stepped inside. He looked half frozen, half broken, his arm bound in cloth dark with blood. The room fell silent. He spoke slowly. The job had been arranged weeks before. Silas Vane had promised to erase the Sutter brothers' debts if they forced Harlan off the ridge and took control of the cabin. The food stores could then be claimed for the basin under official management. Another man in the crowd, one who had attended a private meeting with Vane earlier in the winter, stood and confirmed the story. The room erupted. Voices rose. Chairs scraped. Men who had once laughed at Harlan Vale now blocked the chapel doors to keep Silas Vane from leaving. But Harlan did not speak. He did not accuse. He did not even attend the meeting. Truth had gathered enough weight to stand without him. Silas Vane was not hanged, but his authority collapsed where he stood. His position in the Basin Council vanished. His influence disappeared. By the following night, he had packed his horse and leaving Red Flint Basin behind before the thaw could trap him there. Winter slowly loosened its grip after that. Snow melted along the lower trails. The creek ran louder beneath the thaw. Families began reclaiming their children from the ridge, though a few remained longer to help rebuild the systems that had saved them. Noah Breyer stayed. Maybelle spent most of her days there as well, moving easily between the basin and the cabin that had once been only a stranger's shelter. Together, they expanded the work. A larger smokehouse replaced the burned one. New drying racks stretched farther along the slope. The pit cellar was deepened and lined with fresh stone. For the first time in the basin's history, the settlers began learning the methods they had once mocked. Fruit drying, cold smoking, salting, storing, preparing before the need appeared. By the time the first frost of the following autumn touched the grass in Red Flint Basin, something had changed across the valley. Woodpiles stood higher beside nearly every cabin. Drying frames appeared in more than one yard. Barrels of salt rested in more than one cellar. And when winter returned that year, the cold was just as sharp. The storms were just as fierce. But something else had changed. Not a single child in Red Flint Basin died from hunger or freezing. On a quiet evening after the first snowfall, Harlan Vale stood once more on the small porch above the ridge. Below him, the basin looked different now. Smoke rose evenly from chimneys. Families moved with purpose through the early snow. They had learned the lesson winter had written into the land long before any of them arrived. Winter never announces itself when it begins. And by the time a man realizes he must prepare, it is already too late. If you had lived in Red Flint Basin that summer, would you have prepared like Harlan Vale, or would you have laughed with the rest of the valley?